Surprisingly, the hardware limitations of the time were actually helpful in building a scary atmosphere. The famous fixed-angle cameras made the player feel deprived of information, and the sound design made the imagination work over time. Think about it. When you don't see the enemy but you can hear it, you don't know what to expect. The zombie could be around any corner. To make it worse, there's barely any music. All you hear are your own footsteps echoing down the hallways of this massive mansion, and when they're interrupted by ambient sounds or the sounds of enemies, your heart starts racing. Though unsurprisingly, you're not an action hero. You have limited ammo and every missed shot means potential death. You have to carefully manage your inventory because you can't carry 10 machine guns and a truck full of ammo. Constantly thinking whether you should take a health item or more ammo adds more stress, making you even more uncomfortable. And the game doesn't automatically save progress, so if you die, you die. While it wasn't a hardware limitation, it was intentional. They wanted to make the player feel even more uncomfortable and make you think about your actions twice. You have a limited number of ribbons that you can use at very specific locations to save progress, and you guessed it, you have to carry them with you, and they take up space. That made navigating the mansion even more complicated. The mansion itself is designed like a puzzle. There is a lot of backtracking. You pick up an item here, which yes, again takes up space, and carry it all the way to the other end of the mansion. Just pray you don't die in the process. That made the game very tense, and the sound design amplified the experience. The game kept you on the edge of your seat. However, as I said, Capcom had huge doubts and thought that the game was destined to fail. And given how unforgiving the game felt, that was a logical conclusion. But to the surprise of everyone, the game became not only a bestseller, but also created a whole new genre, survival horror. It was so influential that even 3 decades later, you can find game templates on Unreal Marketplace that feature the famous fixed-angle camera. As a game developer, it's nice to have something like that. It's instant inspiration. By 2002, Capcom had released 5 games in the series, and creatively, it was almost exhausted. The company wanted to make a new game, sure, but they had no clue how to continue. Shinji Mikami said that they knew that they were repeating themselves. There was only one solution. They had to reinvent themselves again, and reinvent themselves they did. 3 times, to be precise. You see, before Resident Evil 4 became one of the most influential games ever made, it went through a lot of changes. Those changes were so drastic that even Shinji Mikami believed that getting them wrong could have killed the franchise. The first demo was an action horror. It was fast, set in a gothic castle, had supernatural enemies, and Leon had supernatural abilities. The game almost abandoned horror, but the developers stopped themselves at the right time. Sounds familiar? Well, that's because this demo started the Devil May Cry series, which is mind-blowing. Can you imagine trying to make a video game and accidentally making 2? Anyway, the second demo, although was scrapped, shaped Resident Evil 4 more than any other early version. It introduced infected enemies and the idea that Leon himself could be infected, the beginnings of Las Plagas, and like the other builds, it was set in a castle. But it was still too abstract, mechanics were confusing, and it generally felt wrong. The third demo, however, became the fan favorite. This version was dark and slow, had an enemy similar to the Nemesis called the Hookman, and had strong survival horror vibes in general. But Capcom ended up killing this prototype as well. Brutal? Yes. Important? Also yes. You see, it was relying on scripted scares, didn't solve the problems that the franchise was facing, and still tapped into the old recipe of horror. So after trial and error, Mikami decided to scrap everything and take the lead. It was risky. They threw out everything that the game was known for, tank controls, fixed camera, everything, but they replaced it with something that was going to change the genre and even the industry once again. Before Resident Evil 4, third-person games used fixed or wide follow cameras, but Resident Evil 4 introduced a tight, over-the-shoulder camera that was going to shape games for generations. Think about your favorite third-person game. The Last of Us? Good. God of War? Also good. The camera angle from those games can be traced back to Resident Evil 4. It became the industry standard. Then they changed how you fight the enemies. Classic horror games relied on helplessness, making you avoid confrontation at any cost, just like in Resident Evil 1. But in Resident Evil 4, you can fight back. But to keep the pressure on, they introduced enemies that can flank, throw stuff at you, and surround you. The new pressure point was the combat itself. It became even more stressful. Speaking of enemies, they became smarter as well. We were used to zombies that had no clue what they were doing and would simply attack you even if you had an RPG. This time, however, they were smart. They reacted to your shots, used weapons, and coordinated their attacks. This, once again, influenced the next generation of games and how they approach enemy behavior. It redefined what horror games could be in general. The genre wasn't afraid of action anymore and proved that mechanics and atmosphere can coexist. Then there is music. Just like the game, it's terrifying. It uses the best practices of horror music to make you focus and dread the next enemy encounter. It has a wide range of styles. Some songs are ambient, some are more action-oriented, and some are genuinely scary. Such music uses a lot of layers of ambient drones, the kind that you can find in contact libraries like Gravity or Heaviosity. Here is an example I made to refresh your memory. Honestly, it's not surprising that the game got a remake. It was that influential. It saved the series by breaking the rules, but it did so carefully. I don't like what happened next. You see, Resident Evil 4, despite being a huge success, caused an identity crisis in the series. It almost seemed like Capcom took the wrong lessons to heart. On top of that, they thought that to break into the North American market, they had to rely on action more heavily. So naturally, they thought that more pew-pew equals more success. And that thought almost killed the franchise with Resident Evil 5 and 6. Resident Evil 5 was... what's the word I'm looking for? A total kaput. Don't get me wrong, the sales were great, but the game itself started drifting too far away from what it was supposed to be. They basically said, what if you were strong, had a machine gun, and had a friend to tell you jokes, and threw horror out the window. Let's unpack a little bit here, because it might have come across a bit too harsh. The problem with Resident Evil 5 was that it wasn't really a horror game anymore, at least in my opinion. It was the first game in the series that I actually played, and I genuinely thought it was a fun zombie shooter. I had no clue that it was supposed to be a horror game. Instead of dark and moody environments, you were put in Africa in broad daylight, and if you were playing solo, Shiva would make you rage quit before you get to chapter 3. You had to constantly babysit her, and she would get stuck. Enemy design became more of a, well, action-oriented. The story also wasn't great, and the infamous volcano punch, I mean, what even was that? So obviously fans were puzzled. What happened?
What happened?
And more importantly, what should we expect from the next game? Another shooter leaning into the blockbuster territory? And blockbuster territory it was. When I say Resident Evil 6 was bad, I mean it. So much so that Capcom themselves publicly said it. So what happened? Well, Resident Evil 6 was an attempt to chase bigger sales, please every type of Resident Evil fan, and turn the game into a global blockbuster. They wanted the biggest Resident Evil game ever. It had 4 different campaigns injected with co-op and constant Hollywood-level explosions, and each campaign tried to be something different. Sounds wild, right? But it doesn't stop there. Enemies were pretty bad. They became literal bullet sponges. The game relied heavily on cutscenes, and when there were no cutscenes, you had almost constant quick-time events. The game literally never hits the brakes. When my friend and I were playing this game, we were genuinely laughing at the absurdity of it all. If someone told us it was supposed to be a horror game, we would laugh even harder. The music in this game, well, too Hollywood to be honest. The main theme itself sounds more like a James Bond movie than a game where you're supposed to fear every enemy. As always, here is an example to refresh your memory. At the end of the day, this game shattered players' trust. Capcom went radio silent for years. A lot of fans assumed that the franchise was dead, or even worse, that they will come back with an even bigger Hollywood movie of a game. Basically, the same thing that happened to the Dead Space series after Dead Space 3. I've already made a video about it, so you can check it out after this video. Anyway, that radio silence was actually a facade. Capcom didn't want to abandon the series, but they realized that if they didn't reinvent themselves yet again, the series will become obsolete. And while nobody outside of the company knew about Resident Evil 7, it was already in the works. But this time, they were smart about it. They intentionally downsized the team, similar to the size of the first Resident Evil games. They wanted to avoid clashing of ideas. They wanted to stay focused and go in one direction. They started prototyping fear and horror before any other mechanics, and after trial and error, they discovered that the game feels scarier in the first person. That's something the series had never done before. The pacing was slower, and encounters with enemies were deadly and horrifying. In this game, the main enemies wouldn't just die because you shot them. Sounds familiar? The Nemesis strikes back. On top of that, they went back to their roots and designed the Baker's house to be a puzzle, a house of horror, just like in the first game. But at the same time, the setting was now somewhat realistic, and updated graphics amplified the horror even more. But my favorite part of it all is that the sound design became the cornerstone of horror once again. It was one of the main reasons why Resident Evil 7 was as scary as it was, and why it worked at all. You see, in the first person, you can't see danger unless it's directly in front of you. That is very close to how we felt in the first Resident Evil game, where the fixed camera angles deprived us of information. You constantly hear footsteps, creaks of the wooden floors, doors opening somewhere, but you never truly know where Jack is until it's too late.
Welcome to the family, son.
And music was intentional. It's very subtle and often appears and disappears without you even noticing, unless you're a nerd like me. Jokes aside, Capcom genuinely did their homework and tried to win the trust of their fans back. The bizarre mistakes they made developing Resident Evil 5 and 6 were corrected, and now it was time to reveal it to the world. But Capcom didn't just want to say, hey, we made a new Resident Evil game. No, they wanted to win the trust and love back. They didn't want the name of the series to carry the announcement. So what did they do? In 2016, they went to E3, the biggest gaming event at the time, and brought a trailer. But it wasn't just a trailer. As I said, they didn't want to reveal that it was a Resident Evil game right away. They wanted people to feel it. Watching the trailer, people couldn't even understand what game it was, but they were absolutely intrigued. The music intensified, the rapid changes of scenes, everything was top-notch. And then the title came on the screen, and the audience exploded. It was historical. Even though I said music is subtle in this game, the developers used it brilliantly in the trailer. It's cinematic, orchestral, and sounds like a lullaby with a twist. The lyrics are, well, about death and being locked up in a basement. Even better, the song doesn't rely on pianos like most horror songs do. Instead, they used a lot of strings and cellos. And to amplify the horror, you hear a lot of risers, which are sounds that go from quiet to loud. And as far as I can tell, some of those risers weren't even from cinematic libraries like Gravity. They were actual, processed reverse screams. Here is an example I made to demonstrate what I mean. All of that meant that Capcom learned their lesson. They realized that in order to move forward, they had to go back to their roots. Resident Evil 7 brought the franchise back, but most importantly, it earned back the trust and love. As of 2026, Resident Evil 7 has sold over 15 million copies worldwide, making it one of the highest-selling games in the franchise. Basically, ever since the release of the game, it's been selling over 1 million copies a year, and for a good reason. The game was good. Both the critics and fans loved it, and the franchise earned the right to continue. There are many developers that can publicly say, yes, we messed up, and we will do better next time, and then prove it. Capcom is one of those companies. And with Resident Evil Requiem coming soon, I am more than excited to see where the series takes us next. My name is Mike Cole, subscribe to the channel, join the Discord server, and as always, stay awesome and keep making this world a better place.